You know, in conversations between Christians and Muslims, there's this one question that always comes up. It feels like a total checkmate, right? Just show me the verse. It seems impossible to answer. Well, today, we're going to break down a framework that does exactly that. But here's the twist. It's not about finding that one magical verse. It's about changing the rules of the game entirely.
I mean, it's such a direct and pointed question. It really does feel like a knockout punch in a debate. It's demanding a super specific kind of proof, right? One single sentence, verbatim, I am God. But what if that demand itself is a kind of trap?
What if the real power of that question has less to do with logic and more to do with its setup? The whole perspective we're digging into today suggests that the entire premise is, well, it's built on a pretty shaky foundation. It sets up a standard of proof that, as we'll see, isn't really applied fairly across the board.
And this is where things get really interesting. It leads to a pretty powerful counter-question. Before we even try to answer, let's take a step back and look at the question itself. What happens if we take that exact same standard, that show me the verse demand, and apply it to other core religious beliefs?
All right, so this is the first big move in the framework, testing that standard for consistency. The strategy is simple, really, is to turn the tables and apply that exact same demand to some of the foundational tenets of Islam.
Okay, let's take the 5 daily prayers. I mean, this is a fundamental pillar of Islam, right? But where in the Quran do you find one single explicit verse that says you must pray 5 times a day? That practice, as foundational as it is actually derived from the Hadith, the collected traditions of the Prophet, not from one specific Quranic command.
Or here's another example, the story of Abraham's sacrifice. Now, the Quran tells the story, but it never actually names which son was on the altar. The identification of Ishmael as the son comes from later interpretation and tradition, something called tafsir. Again, it's not from a single, unambiguous sentence in the holy text itself.
So, what's the big takeaway here? It's that both Christianity and Islam build some of their core doctrines by piecing things together from multiple texts, from context, from tradition. That demand for a single, isolated proof text is a standard that really neither faith consistently applies to itself. It creates a kind of uneven playing field, you know?
Okay, so if we agree that the single verse standard is a bit flawed, then the next logical question is, how does the Bible make its case for Jesus' divinity? This is where the argument shifts, moving away from a hunt for one sentence and instead looking at his actions and the titles he claimed for himself. So, in the Gospel of John, Jesus makes this just absolutely staggering claim. He says, "Truly, truly I say to you, before Abraham was, I am." Now, for his Jewish audience, that phrase, I am, was completely unmistakable. It was a direct echo of the sacred name God revealed to Moses at the burning bush. It was basically a claim to be eternal, to have existed before anyone else.
But here's the kicker. It wasn't just what he said, it's how the audience reacted. The people who heard him say this, the people who understood the incredible theological weight of I am, they didn't just disagree or argue. No, they immediately picked up stones to kill him for blasphemy. Their reaction is presented as the ultimate proof of how that claim was understood in that moment.
And believe me, this was not a one-off thing. A clear pattern starts to emerge. He claimed he had the authority to forgive sins, and what did his critics say? Whoa, hold on, only God can do that. He accepted worship, which was something reserved only for God. And when Thomas, after seeing the resurrected Jesus, cried out, "My Lord and my God," Jesus didn't correct him, he affirmed it. In case after case, the people around him totally got the divine implications of what he was doing.
And this distinction is absolutely crucial. If you look elsewhere in the Bible, whenever holy men or even angels are offered worship, they basically freak out, they recoil. They say things like, "Get up, worship God, not me." But Jesus? He's repeatedly shown accepting that worship without any correction at all. And that silent acceptance, well, that's presented as an incredibly powerful nonverbal claim to divinity.
Okay, but this brings up a really obvious question, right? If he was making all these claims, why not just say it plainly? Why not just use this simple formula, I am God? Well, the answer, according to this framework, lies in the very unique historical and theological context he was in.
I mean, just think about his audience for a second. This was a fiercely monotheistic Jewish culture. If he just came out and said, "I am God," it would have sounded like he was claiming to be a second God, a competing God. That would have been a non-starter. So instead, his approach was more like a master teacher's. It was gradual,
Through his actions, through questions, he slowly revealed this much more complex, much more challenging idea about the very nature of God, what we now call the Trinity, without completely shattering that monotheistic foundation they held so dear.
So, how do you actually use all this in a real conversation? That brings us to the final part of the framework. It's basically a step-by-step guide designed to shift the whole dynamic, moving away from a hostile debate and towards a more productive, thoughtful dialogue.
So here it is, the 5-step approach. And what's really key here is how it starts. It doesn't jump into a defensive answer. It begins by saying, hey, let's just agree on the rules first. Let's find a consistent standard of proof. Only then does it lay out the biblical case, explain the why behind the context, and then, finally, it gently turns the question back to the other person, asking them to consider all the evidence for themselves.
And really, the entire goal of this framework is to, well, it's to broaden the lens. It moves the conversation away from this microscopic hunt for one specific sentence and zooms out to look at the entire landscape of evidence. We're talking about the claims, the actions, and, just as importantly, the reactions of the people who are actually there to witness it all. And that really brings us to the final, challenging thought that this whole framework leaves us with. What actually matters more? Finding one perfect, neatly packaged verbal formula, or weighing the evidence of an entire lifetime of words and deeds? The question isn't really whether Jesus ever spoke those exact 4 words, "I am God." The deeper question is whether his entire life was a living, breathing demonstration of that very truth.